A guten Erev Shabbos, Gemar Chatima Tova. Listen to this story about forgiveness. A certain man had an appointment to meet with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, the great halachic decisor of the last generation. He came to Rav Moshe's apartment. While he was waiting his turn to speak to him, he heard Rav Moshe in a conversation with two men for whom he had just adjudicated a din Torah, a rabbinic court proceeding. Rav Moshe said to the first man, Ruvain, ask Shimon for forgiveness. And Shimon, you forgive Ruvain. Ruvain said to Shimon, I'm sorry for what I did. Please forgive me. Shimon said, it's fine. It's not a problem. Don't worry about it. Rav Moshe said to Shimon, no, that's not enough. Tell him you forgive him and that you grant him mechila. Shimon said, really, I'm not angry. You worked out everything for us, Rabbi, and I see it's all min hashamayim. It's all from above, and I accept it. Rav Moshe said, please tell him in clear words that you forgive him. Shimon now understood what was being asked of him, and he said, Ruvain, I forgive you. I am moichel you. The two men shook hands and left Rav Moshe's study. When the fellow who was waiting finally came in to meet Rav Moshe, he asked, I hope you don't mind, but I overheard you insisting that the one person say clearly and explicitly that he forgave the other one. Why the insistence on this particular articulation of forgiveness? So Rav Moshe took out the commentary of Rabbeinu Bachya on the Chumash and pointed out the commentary on Parshas Vayechi, the end of the book of Genesis. After Yaakov Avinu, after Jacob passed away, Joseph's brothers feared that now their father was gone, and Joseph would take his revenge for having sold him into slavery decades ago. They said, Lu yistemenu v'hayshev yoshev lanu es kol hara'a asher gamalnu oisai. Perhaps Joseph will nurse hatred against us and will surely repay us for the evil that we did to him. The brothers said to Yosef, oh, please kindly forgive the glaring offense of your brothers. Ana sa na pesha echecha. Joseph cried when he heard these words, and he said, don't worry. Even though you intended it for harm, God intended it for the good. So now, don't be afraid. I will sustain you, and I'll sustain your children. Al tiro, v'chashavtem alai ra, Elokim chshavai l'toiva, v'ata al tiru, v'atira'u, v'anoichi achalkel eschem v'estapchem. However, Rabbeinu Bachya writes, Yosef never said the words, I forgive you, or I pardon you, for what they had done. This means, in effect, that all the brothers died without having received actual forgiveness for their actions, because there was no closure to the event without Yosef expressing forgiveness. The brothers escaped retaliation in their lifetimes, but the unforgiven debt remained on the books, so to speak, as we learn in a very stark way on Yom Kippur. Monday's Musaf for Yom Kippur includes a shattering passage called Asara Harugi Malchus, the 10 martyrs, or Ela Ezkara, this I remember. The story, the horrible story is this: the Roman Emperor Hadrian calls Rabban Gamliel and the sages together to ask them a question. He says, I'm looking here in the portion of Mishpatim in your Torah, and I see an interesting halacha. It says, he's pointing to chapter 21 of Exodus, where it says, one who steals a man and sells him and is found out shall surely be put to death. So he turns to the sages and says, now tell me, and don't play any games, what is the law in your books if a man is found kidnapping one of his brothers and treats him as a slave and sells him? And the sages have nothing other to say than the kidnapper shall be put to death. Your stomach sinks as you realize where this is going. You'll take a look in your machzor when you get home. It's on page 930. So Hadrian says, what about the guilt of your ancestors who sold their brother Joseph to the Ishmaelites, handing him over for the price of a pair of shoes? If they were alive, I would hold them culpable for punishment. But they are not here, so you shall pay for their sins. And he proceeds to execute all 10 of them in the most grisly ways. Rabbi Sachs has a different view of all of this. In the book Morality, which we read a few years ago together when it came out, Rabbi Sachs argues that even though Joseph didn't say it, the fact that he did not take revenge on his brothers, not when their father was alive, not after the father passed away, shows the highest level of peaceful coexistence that human beings can aspire to. That we can, in fact, learn to forgive each other and carry on without carrying grudges. That's a very worthwhile and valid view, and yet it doesn't seem to be how Rabbeinu Bachya saw it from his vantage point in Spain 800 years ago. This lack of mechila, this failure or refusal to say the words, "I forgive you," are a tremendous and costly stumbling block, and not for anyone else more than for us ourselves. I'll share with you that I carried a grudge, not for a year, not for 5 years, for 25 years. I'll tell you the story about it some other time. Finally, I said I can't carry this burden of resentment any longer, and I got up my courage and forgave the person. I wish I would have done it decades before. On Yom Kippur, we are asking God to forgive us. Salach lanu, machal lanu, kaper lanu. We started speaking about this a few weeks ago. Those 3 Hebrew words basically all mean forgive us. But there are different fine layers of meaning. Salach lanu is salicha. Excuse me, I beg your pardon, I'm sorry for what I did. I sincerely regret having done it. According to what we learn in all the texts of Jewish law, the appropriate response to this kind of apology is to accept it and grant forgiveness and pardon with a whole heart. Machal lanu, or mechila, means to wipe away. We're asking the injured party not only to forgive, but to restore the relationship to its sphere of trust and friendship and warmth that it had before the offense took place. This is a little more difficult because it involves uncoupling anger and resentment from memory. The bitter feelings have to be let go of, released, allowed to fade and dissolve. Kapara is even a different realm. One view is that it means to remove the stain of the offense from the relationship. When you spill coffee on a shirt, you can wash it a few times and you might still have a little stain there that's visible when you hold it up to just the right light. Right? Kapara is the idea of removing that stain so the accident is no longer visible under any circumstances. Another view, maybe it's an elaboration of that view, is that kapara takes away the bad feeling from the perpetrator, the remorse and regret of the slight, that nagging feeling that if I had to do it all over again, that's also gone. Even the regret that I ever let anything come between us. Kapara takes that away. The major view is that only God can effect kapara like this. We can set everything up, put all the pieces in place, but Yom Kippur, God's festival of forgiveness, is mechaper. It grants kapara. Forgiveness is under the larger rubric of teshuva itself. To do teshuva, we must first admit that we have done something wrong. This is called vidui, confession. You can't move on unless you admit the wrong. There is such a thing as a doubtful transgression. The classic example in the Talmud and other sources is that if on a table is a serving of forbidden food and a serving of permitted food, and a person eats one of them, it's doubtful, although it's possible, that the person might have eaten the forbidden food. So, however, since a sin may have occurred, the person has a responsibility to do some teshuva. And the offering, as part of the process, must cost more than a regular sin offering for a sin that was definitely committed. Why is that? Because we're eager to tell ourselves that we probably didn't sin. Everyone wants to be righteous in their own eyes, so for ourselves we always err on the side of the good. I'm sure I ate the kosher one. Must have been, right? The real problem is how this plays out with interpersonal relationships. In a very candid thought, the thought might occur, in a very candid moment, the thought might occur, wow, what I said might have hurt that person's feelings. In the next moment, we say, nah, first of all, I didn't mean it that way. Second of all, I'm sure they know that I meant no harm. I was only joking. And besides, I was having a bad day. Meanwhile, on the other end of the communication, there might well be some hard feelings. which is why we have to seek others out and ask for forgiveness and apologize and put even more effort into it, because we tell ourselves that we meant no harm. But it could be that indeed harm was done, and we have to put in extra effort to make good on those incidents. I'm looking very much forward to seeing Rabbi Beshefkin, our friend and high holiday scholar in residence for many years already, on Yom Kippur at KST. For those who don't know, he used to write a column in a very popular Frum magazine called Mishpacha. The weekly column was top 5 lists of Judaism, and they were both hilarious and insightful looks into Jewish culture and perspective on everything from the top 5 ways to spell Hanukkah, to the top 5 ways his mother lets them know it's almost Pesach, to the top 5 ways Jews try to lose weight, to the top 5 Jewish organization dinner moments. Some greatest hits were collected in a book and published a few years ago for ready reference. Under the top 5 ways not to ask forgiveness, he gives these, and I'm summarizing by taking most of the funny out. One is a passive-aggressive text, wherein New Year makeups is sent via a text with plenty of subtext that makes you unsure who owes whom an apology. Another one is the WhatsApp broadcast, where every administrator of a WhatsApp list sends their deepest apologies and sincerest best wishes to everyone on the WhatsApp list. In other words, it's meaningless. Third is the emoji with the apple emoji and the honey emoji. Then there's the just in case message, which says, I can't think of anything I've done to wrong you, but just in case, I'm asking your forgiveness. And finally, the jewel in the crown, which is the if apology. Here, Rabbi Beshefkin writes, nothing ruins a sincere, I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, like adding those 2 awful letters and transforming an earnest gesture toward forgiveness into a conditional hedge. If I hurt your feelings. Again, these are hilarious and even more true when Rabbi Beshefkin writes them, so I encourage you to have a look or get yourself a copy of the book. What he's bringing out in his own inimitable way is that we are trying for sincerity. We're trying our best to make amends and to keep civil relationships, but it's hard for others and it's hard for us. It's a challenge when ego and personality and history and pride and so many other emotions get mixed in. It's hard to confront mistakes that were made in the past, and it's even harder to bring them back up from the depths of our memory where they may have been festering over time, and allow them to finally see the light of day and perspective and context, and ultimately forgiveness, so that we can move forward in our lives without these things weighing us down. 2 ethics professors in the UK and the US, Eve Gerard and David McNaughton, wrote a book a few years back for a series called The Art of Living. The book is called Forgiveness. They acknowledge that forgiveness, both giving it and withholding it, is something that we're all involved in, one way or another. We've all had wrongs committed against us, which leave behind feelings of ill will and resentment. We have to decide whether to maintain those feelings or abandon them and maintain indifference and forgetting, or perhaps choose the path of goodwill and reconciliation, which is in fact closer to forgiveness. They write that it's a very normal feature of knowing that you've done something wrong to wish you could go back and change things, and failing that, wishing that you could change the impact or significance or meaning of what you've done. On the other hand, they write, what about forgiving people who have not repented for their ways, not even apologized, or acknowledged and even admitted their hurtful actions? This argues against forgiveness, but inconclusively, they say. Gerard and McNaughton explore a third way, which is to seek to rise above hatred and resentment, which does nobody any good, and forgiveness, which sometimes doesn't seem possible, particularly when there are terrible crimes. Or at the other end of the spectrum, offenses that are not criminal and therefore not punishable, but still drive a wedge between people. That is to gain perspective on one's own about the point of view of the offender. In their analysis, they cannot come out and say that forgiveness is a moral imperative because they're not moralists. They believe that forgiveness is always permissible and often makes good sense. In our world, we're ready to go it a step further and say that we should always forgive. Why is this? Because we base ourselves on the Shulchan Aruch's statement that we just read in Shul the other morning, that sins of one person against another are not forgiven by Yom Kippur. Only when we seek out the other person and ask their forgiveness and reconcile with them are these unfortunate situations resolved. And the Kitzur goes further to say that if a person does not forgive others, then that person's prayers on Yom Kippur are not heeded, God forbid. In other words, God will not grant them forgiveness, the forgiveness they ask for, if they themselves do not extend that courtesy to others. In other words, we cannot ask for ourselves what we are unwilling to give to others. We cannot, it's disingenuous to ask God to forgive us for all the things we have done wrong, willingly or unknowingly, if we withhold that forgiveness from others. And the consequences can be not only severe, they can be so long-lasting as to remain in the air for years, even centuries, which is what the passage from Musaf is trying to tell us. Until we clear the air and give forgiveness, mechila, salicha, with a whole heart and with full expression, we cannot move on. To close, just two brief stories, neither one of them earth-shattering, but both of them real, actual stories. They're not wow stories, but rather stories that we can relate to and perhaps see ourselves in, because they happen in all relationships, all families in some degree or other, and if we can identify them, that's a major step towards healing them. One is about a girl who, when she was young, was close with her aunt, until the young woman started to become a little bit more religiously observant. Bit by bit, a gap developed between the two relatives, the niece and the aunt, until they finally had it out at a family event one day, and wound up not speaking to one another for 13 years. Excuse me. After that long time, when the young woman thought each Erev Yom Kippur of getting in touch with her aunt and reconciling, when she got married and was expecting a baby, once the baby was born, the young woman, now a young mother, named her new daughter after her grandmother, who was, of course, her aunt's mother. She received a warm letter from her aunt saying how touched she was that her mother's Jewish name was being passed on to a new generation, and she signed it, "Love, your Aunt Rose." It seems that time healed this wound. Another family story is of two best friends from school who wound up marrying into the same family. There were tensions, as there are in every family, but when the patriarch of the family passed away, each of the two best friends, now brothers-in-law, blamed the other for the stress that had led to Zayd's heart attack. As a result, as unfortunately happens, they stopped speaking to one another. A week, a month, a year, 20 years, the former best friends did not speak, until they did. Living their adult lives in separate time zones, they found themselves together for the bar mitzvah of a grandchild. After decades of silence, they renewed their contact and friendship and their lost time, and somehow managed to forgive and move beyond the hurts of 20 years before. The time is lost time when we close others out, or when we find ourselves closed out of the lives of others. It doesn't do anyone any good to nurture these resentments, but we are who we are, and sometimes it takes time. The wise thing is to realize that now is already late, and soon will be, or may be, too late. Time to seek out the place to mend relationships, rebuild bridges, and give life back to ourselves and the ones we love and our relationship with them. That reconciliation, mechila, restoration, forgiveness, will surely bring nachas to the Father of us all. And when his children can live in peace and companionship, as King David writes in Tehillim, as we all know, Psalm 133, Hinei ma tov u'manayim, sheves achim gam yachad, how good and pleasant it is when siblings can dwell together in peace. Shana tova u'metuka, it should be a happy and healthy and sweet year for all of us. A good Shabbos.